Hi there everyone, my name's Josh Hall. I'm going to be going through a tutorial for how to composite 3D objects into After Effects. The reason why I'm doing it is because I did a fair amount of looking about online and couldn't find anything that showed you how to do it. So what we're going to do is just start off in After Effects in a new project. We'll go New Composition from Footage, and let's just load up the video that we want to composite our elements into. So I have this video at the moment. It's just a little bit of motion. When you're doing camera tracking, you need to have a certain amount of motion so that the camera tracking can pick up the 3D space. It needs to pick up points and be able to track them around and then get an idea where everything is going in the space. So this one's fine for that. And I'm going to take an object and I'm going to probably stick it about here. We start in After Effects, but one thing to note is that After Effects can't really handle 3D objects directly. So we have to use Cinema 4D for doing that. And After Effects, if you have the Creative Cloud version, After Effects will have Cinema 4D Lite built into it. It's just a little bit of a funny way of getting it. So I'll show you that in a minute. The first thing to do is start our camera tracking on this one. So we have our video selected, we go to animation, and we just say track camera. This process will take a certain amount of time. The computer has to go through and analyze each of the frames for the video, try and pick out feature points, and then track them across each frame to get an idea of how the camera is moving, some information about the camera lens and things like that. So I'll just let this finish the process. So you can see it's not too slow. It's not immediate, but it's if you have a much longer bit of video, obviously it's going to take a bit longer to do this process. And now it's finished that stage. It's just solving for the camera, and you'll see that we have all these track points that have been picked up through the video, and as we scrub through the timeline, we'll see that it's following these points in the 3D space. So now what we want to do is mark points within this scene that we're going to use in our 3D editor to position our 3D object. So what we can do is select one of these tracking points, and this first time that we do it, we'll want to create a camera as well. So we can say create null and camera or create solid and camera. Either one will create a camera. What we want to do is create a bunch of these that we can then export to Cinema 4D and then get an idea of where we want our object to be relative to these. At some point we also want to create a solid that we can use. If we wanted to have a shadow, then we'd create a solid that would be our stand-in for our surface, for example. So I'm going to say create null and camera. You'll see that it's created the tracking camera. And when we export that out, or if we look in the top view, for example, with the 3D track camera selected, it shows that it's figured out the motion of the camera in 3D space. So that's the top view, this is the front view, where it was in 3D space to produce that video. Just go back to the active camera and go back into the camera tracking effect. So we've got one null point. I'm just going to add some here, and I'll also add a surface that we can use for the table. We're not going to do any shadows in this one. In a later video I'll show you how to composite in shadows from Cinema 4D Lite, which is a really good skill to get into. It's also not completely straightforward. So let's go back to this. Add these points, so create null for all of these. Now I've got that little corner. I'll create maybe think that's fine. I'll make a little square, and then I know I can stick it, my object, relative to that square. And yeah, that looks good. So now what we need to do is export this information to a format that Cinema 4D can take. So we go to File, Export, Maxon Cinema 4D Exporter. It's complaining that one of the layers isn't 3D, which is the original video. That's fine, we can safely ignore it. And it's also telling us that we need to save. We do need to save before we export, so let's go and save. And I'll just call it... Okay, so now I've saved this project, I can export the Cinema 4D file. And I will call it, I'll give it the same name. Just call it, it'll have that as an extension anyway, but it'll just make it easier to tell. And now to open up Cinema 4D, you can't do it through the Creative Cloud access, you can't do it through your normal app list. You go to New, Maxon Cinema 4D file. And because I'm only using this, I want to open this file in a second. I'm just using this to open Cinema 4D, so I'm just going to save it as a untitled. We won't be using the file that's being created now, we're just using it as a way of opening up Cinema 4D. Okay, so now that I've opened up Cinema 4D, this is what we would use for putting 3D elements, importing 3D models and things like that into this view, doing keyframing of position, for example, all sorts of bits. I am going to open up that file that I just exported. So that one there, camera tracking, Cinema 4D. And what should happen is, as we scrub through the view, our camera will move around correctly for where it's been tracked in After Effects. You'll see as well, if we use our middle mouse button to click into this view, so we have all of these components. Let's just... You'll see that our points aren't aligned on either X, Y, or Z plane, so the camera is at a bit of a weird angle for this exported out information. What we probably want to do is go back into After Effects, and we can rotate everything around to get it into a nice alignment so that this plane of the table is flat relative to the motion of the camera. So what we do for that is we'll go to, actually we'll start off with the front view. We want to make sure that all of these are along a plane and the camera isn't, well, the camera we were holding in weird ways, so it doesn't really matter what the camera view is, but these are flat in our world, so we want these points to be flat here. So what we'll do is we'll parent all of these objects, including the camera. We want to rotate all of them at the same time because we're changing all of our 3D objects. We will make them all children of the first null object. So I'll just go through and add them all to that. We don't need to do it for the main video. And now what that means is we can go into this null object, which is just a placeholder, just an anchor. We can rotate everything around until they appear to be on a flat plane. If we want them to be centered to our 3D space in Cinema 4D, we also want them to be center to this view. So we can lift them up and put the center of those points in the center of our view. So we can turn on this guide, which just tells us where the center of our view is, just using title safe. We'll go to the top view again, and we'll move them into the center there. So and that way in our 3D space in Cinema 4D, we'll just be basically placing our object in the center at position 0, 0, 0, and then we won't have to do too much work. The alignment is important though, because if we were moving, for example, our object up and down in 3D space, it wouldn't be correctly aligned. It would go off at a weird angle because our points aren't aligned to the 3D space. So what we're doing now is aligning these points so that when we export them in our 3D space, our camera and everything will be aligned to the XYZ axis as much as possible. So that's pretty close actually. Fairly happy with that positioning. Those center points seem okay. They're not perfect, but for what we're doing, they should be fine. So I'll just close that again, and I will export this out again. And reopen it in Cinema 4D. Actually close and reopen just to make sure that it updates. Okay, so now you see that these points are positioned in the center of the world, and if I middle mouse button click, you'll see that from the front view they're pretty much aligned. We could have rotated a little bit more to get it straight. Up is sort of in that direction, but that's fine for what we're doing. Those ones are okay, and it's right from the top view. We can see it's right in the middle of our 3D space where the object will be. So now what we can do is bring in our 3D object. So if we say merge, we can open up our object. This is just a sphere that we created. And just going to set this angle higher so it renders a little bit better and bring it in. It's come in very small. It might be whatever size. It's an arbitrary size that you export it in, so your object could be all sorts of different sizes, but we know that this is a reasonable size between these anchor points that we've created. So I'm going to make it slightly bigger than those and just have a go at changing the scale. So I've set this to scale, and we just want to hit enter for each one to apply the scale up. Okay, so it's still quite small. Might make it 4 times bigger. Okay, there's our object. Now, this view that we're looking through at the moment is the camera view. So if we want to do anything to move around this view, we want to turn this off, otherwise we'll be moving the camera position for any of these keyframes. We don't want to touch that at all because we want our camera position to remain how it's been exported. So if we click that, we leave the view from the camera and go into just a viewport, and we can navigate around just to see what our object looks like without modifying the camera position. That's quite important, because if you do and you export it again back into After Effects, one of your camera points will be a bit weird and the object will jump around just for that keyframe position that you're on. So I'm going to raise my object up a little bit so it's hovering above the table, and yeah, that should be fine. Now our object has come in without any materials, so I'm going to set the materials. If I click on this little button here, then I can start to get into the material properties. I go to materials. If you have normal mapping or any other textures to apply to it, you can set them up here. So this one does have normal mapping. I just go through the tag. We've collapsed we've uncollapsed the material setting, and in the basic setting we can add that in, and as we add it in, it just adds another tab that we set it up in. So color, let's just go through and select the object, so the object texture, which is that one. Okay, and it's been applied there. Reflectance, I'm just going to bring that down because I don't want it to be too reflective. The normal map I will load up now, and it's fine. If we click in this view and hit Control R, we can render and see what it looks like. Just going to zoom in a little bit more. So that's what it looks like. That looks fine. And I think we're just about ready to export. So before we export, we just want to go back into this camera view, and I will save the file. Yes. Go back into After Effects and import the file in. So that's the file. If we leave Cinema 4D open, then when we make changes in Cinema 4D, go back into After Effects, it should automatically update. If you're having a problem with automatically updating, then you need to turn on a setting, which is Preferences, Communication. Just make sure that the Live Link is turned on. So let's go into After Effects. We've imported back in our Cinema 4D file. If we drag that down into the top, go back to our active camera, and we should see as we scrub along that our 3D object is floating there in space. So there's a few other things that we want to do now that we've imported this in. If we uncollapse the Cinema 4D file, we want to set the rendering setting to standard final, so it's the highest quality. We can turn off the guide that we turned on before, and we can turn off these anchor points that we set up before, and that is pretty much ready to go. I think if we rendered with this, then we should be good. In the next video, actually before we go into the next video, I will set up a light to simulate similar lighting to what's in the scene. So I'll just save what we've got at the moment, Control S, go back into Cinema 4D, and let's have a look at setting up a light. So go to the little light icon, hold it down, select light, and before I move the view anymore, I'll just switch the camera track anchor off, and let's move this light around. So we've got a lamp in this video over there which is casting light in that direction, and then there's a bit of ambient light which is lighting this as well. So you'll see that as soon as we add a light, all the ambient light goes away. We can bring that back in a second. So let me have a look at what direction the lamp is actually behind it, in that direction. I'll just so here's our view. Let's say the lamp is back in this direction. It's actually along those points because that's the table. So and it's not too high up, it's actually lower down. If I select the light again to move it, it's actually lower down than the object that we have floating. So it's about there. In line, it might be a bit further across. So about there. So you'll see in this view But we have the light casting from that lamp. We could make it a bit more red or a little bit warmer if we wanted to, because the lamp's quite warm. But we also want to add ambient light, because from this view, obviously the back side of it isn't completely dark. So we'll go to infinite light, add that in, and just modify the intensity until it provides a little bit of fill on that object. And now let's now let's save that. Go back into our After Effects, have a look at the lighting that we've brought in. So there's the light casting a little bit of glow on that side of the object. When we come around the other side, we should just about start to see the light from the other side. Let's see where you can see it from the top there. I might just bring that light, the first light, back along there. So I hold down the green to move in the XZ direction, not moving it up or down. You see it stays at the same height. And I'll just bring it across a little bit to get the position right. Save it, go into After Effects. It's going to update the file. Let's see how we go there. So you can start to see the light coming around on that side as well, which is ideal. Okay, good. So now we could render this. If we were happy with it, we can go to Composition with the composition setup and just say either add to render queue or add to media encoder to encode it H.264, for example, as our output file. And that will go through and render each frame and composite it in how we've set it up. Alright, so the next video I will talk about doing the same thing but with a static image and setting up shadows.